It is the summer of 1876, and America is celebrating itself. In Philadelphia, enormous crowds press against each other in the sweltering heat, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of something nobody has ever seen before, a machine that carries the human voice through a wire across a room, across a city, maybe one day across a continent. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone sits in the Centennial Exhibition like a prophet from another age, and the people who hear their own names spoken back to them through that strange brass instrument go home changed, convinced they are living in the greatest moment in the history of the world. 100 years. 100 years since a group of men in a hot room in Philadelphia signed a document declaring that all men are created equal, that life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness are not privileges granted by kings, but rights belonging to every human being by the simple fact of their existence. America is proud of itself in the summer of 1876. America is very, very proud. But 2,000 miles west of Philadelphia, past the Ohio River and the Mississippi and the endless rolling prairies of Kansas and Nebraska and the rising shoulders of the Rocky Mountains, past all of that, out on the high plains of Montana Territory, a completely different America exists. And in that America, the promises written in Philadelphia mean nothing at all. The Great Plains in 1876 is one of the last places on Earth where the Old World and the New World are still fighting each other with real weapons on real ground, and neither side has yet accepted that the fight is almost over. The grass there grows thick and golden in June, chest high on a horse in the bottomlands along the rivers, and the wind moves through it in long, slow waves that make the whole Earth look like it is breathing. The sky above the plains is not like the sky anywhere else. It is enormous. It goes on in every direction until you stop believing that the earth has edges, and the storms that roll across it in summer are the kind of storms that make grown men understand for the first time in their lives exactly how small they really are. The Lakota Sioux had lived on these plains and the hills beyond them for generations, and they understood this land the way a man understands the house he was born in, every corner and shadow, and the particular way the wind sounds when it comes around the north side of the ridge in winter. They had not always been here. 100 years before, maybe a little more, the Lakota had been pushed west by pressures from the east, other tribes displaced by the relentless advance of European settlement. And when they arrived on the Great Plains, they found something that changed everything about who they were. They found the horse. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas in the 1500s, and over the following 2 centuries those horses had spread north and west through trade and theft, and the simple restlessness of animals finding open ground. And by the time the Lakota got their hands on them in significant numbers, the entire structure of their world transformed almost overnight. The horse gave them speed. The horse gave them range. The horse made it possible to follow the buffalo herds across hundreds of miles of open country, to strike and move and strike again, to carry everything a family needed on the backs of animals instead of the backs of people. The Lakota became, within a few generations, perhaps the finest light cavalry on the planet. Not cavalry in the European sense, not men in formations following orders from officers on raised ground, but cavalry in the truest and oldest sense, men and horses moving together as a single organism, responsive and fast and impossible to pin down. By 1876, the Lakota Nation, which was not one tribe, but 7 distinct bands related by language and culture and long shared history, numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people. They ranged across an enormous territory that covered parts of what are now South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Montana. They hunted buffalo. They traded. They raided. They made war on their traditional enemies and peace with their traditional allies. And for most of the year, they lived the way their grandfathers had lived and their great-grandfathers before them. But everything was changing. The buffalo herds that had once covered the plains in numbers so vast that travelers described the horizon as a single moving dark mass of animals, tens of millions of bison stretching from Canada to Texas, those herds were being destroyed. Not thinned, not reduced, destroyed. The railroad had come to the plains in the late 1860s, and with it came professional hunters with Sharps rifles and the economic logic of the industrial age, hides worth dollars apiece, and the practical understanding that a dead buffalo was useful to a market economy in a way that a living one was not. The hunters killed by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. The carcasses rotted where they fell, and the bones were collected and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer, and the hides were processed and sold, and the great herds that had sustained the plains cultures for 1,000 years began to disappear with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The Lakota understood what this meant. The buffalo were not just food. The buffalo were everything. They were shelter, because the hides made the teepees that kept families warm through the brutal plains winters. They were tools, because the bones and sinew and hooves were worked into implements for every aspect of daily life. They were trade goods and ceremony and spiritual connection and the central fact around which the entire Lakota world was organized. Without the buffalo, the Lakota way of life was not diminished. It was impossible. And then there was the land itself. The United States government had signed a treaty in 1868 at Fort Laramie that guaranteed the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills of South Dakota, a region of deep forests and sheltered valleys and sacred sites that the Lakota called Pahasapa, the heart of everything that is. The treaty was explicit. No white person would be allowed to settle or pass through the territory without the consent of the Lakota people. It was a real treaty, negotiated in good faith by Lakota leaders and ratified by the United States Senate. It was the law of the land, and it lasted exactly as long as it took someone to find gold. In 1874, the United States Army sent an expedition into the Black Hills to assess the territory's potential for military posts and to investigate rumors of mineral wealth. The expedition was led by a man named George Armstrong Custer. He came back with reports that confirmed the rumors. Gold, he said, among the roots of the grass. The news spread with the speed of telegraph wire, which in 1874 meant it spread almost instantly, and within months the first miners were pushing into Lakota territory in violation of the treaty, and then more miners, and then thousands of miners, a human flood that the Army was nominally supposed to stop, but in practice did nothing to discourage. The government's response to this crisis revealed everything about how it viewed the treaty it had signed. Instead of enforcing the law and removing the miners, the government decided to simply buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. A commission was sent to negotiate. The Lakota refused to sell. Pahasapa was not for sale. The government then did something that was legally bizarre and morally straightforward in its dishonesty. In violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty, Congress passed legislation in 1876 that effectively confiscated the Black Hills and opened them to white settlement. The Lakota had not agreed. The Lakota were not consulted. The Lakota were simply told that the land was no longer theirs. And then, to make the situation even more impossible, the government issued an ultimatum in December of 1875. All Lakota and Cheyenne bands not currently living on their designated reservations must report to those reservations by January 31st, 1876. The deadline was set in December, in the middle of a northern plains winter. Travel across hundreds of miles of frozen ground through blizzard conditions was barely possible for able-bodied young men traveling light. For entire villages of men, women, children, and elderly people, moving horses and dogs and everything they owned, it was not possible at all. Many bands never even received the message. The runners couldn't get through. When the deadline passed and the bands had not reported, the government declared them hostile. The word hostile meant, in this context, a legal designation that authorized the military to use force. It was not a description of anyone's behavior. The Lakota who remained off the reservations were not attacking settlers or threatening army posts. They were simply living in the manner they always had, moving with the seasons, following the game. But now they were hostile, and that made them a military problem, and the military began to plan. The plan was a three-pronged campaign designed to trap the non-reservation bands between converging forces. General George Crook would advance north from Wyoming. Colonel John Gibbon would come east from Montana. General Alfred Terry would move west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. Between the three of them, the strategy went, they would find the village or villages of the hostile bands, surround them, and force them onto the reservation. It was a clean plan, the kind of plan that looks elegant on a map in an office hundreds of miles from the terrain it describes. It depended on two assumptions. First, that the three columns could coordinate their movements across hundreds of miles of roadless wilderness without reliable communication. Second, that the hostile bands would behave the way the army expected, moving slowly, staying predictable, and eventually allowing themselves to be caught between converging forces. Both assumptions were wrong. But before we can understand exactly how and why the plan failed, and it failed so completely and so catastrophically that the story of that failure is still being studied and debated a century and a half later, we need to understand the man who was at the center of it. George Armstrong Custer was 36 years old in the summer of 1876, and he had been famous for exactly half of his life. His fame had come from the Civil War, where he had displayed a combination of physical courage, aggressive instinct, and almost mystical luck that had made him a genuine hero of the Union cause. He had graduated last in his class at West Point in 1861, which under normal circumstances would have predicted a modest career at best, but the Civil War was not normal circumstances. The war needed men who would charge, who would press the advantage, who would not hesitate at the moment when hesitation meant defeat, and Custer had those qualities in abundance. By the age of 23, he was a brigadier general, the youngest in the Union Army. By the end of the war, he had risen to Major General of Volunteers, and his cavalry division had played a significant role in the Appomattox campaign that ended the fighting. He had been present at Lee's surrender. Phil Sheridan, one of the great cavalry commanders of the war, presented the table on which the surrender terms were written to Custer's wife Elizabeth as a gift, with a note saying there was no man more deserving. After the war, the famous Custer had become something considerably more ordinary. The army reduced its size dramatically in peacetime, and Custer, who had been a major general, was reduced to his permanent rank of lieutenant colonel. He was assigned to the 7th Cavalry, a regiment being formed to police the frontier, and he threw himself into the work with his characteristic intensity. He fought the Southern Cheyenne on the Washita River in 1868, attacking a village in winter and killing men, women, and children, destroying food and shelter and hundreds of horses, a brutal campaign that the Army called a victory and that the Cheyenne called a massacre. He had led the Black Hills expedition in 1874 that had started the gold rush. He had written a book about his frontier adventures. He had cultivated relationships with newspaper reporters and photographers and had become, in an age before electronic media, the closest thing America had to a celebrity soldier. His long blonde hair, his flamboyant buckskin uniforms, his large pack of hunting dogs, his fondness for dramatic gesture, all of it made for good copy. The newspapers loved him. The public loved him. But by 1876, the luster had begun to fade in ways that Custer felt very deeply. He had made enemies in Washington. He had testified before Congress about corruption in the administration of the Indian agencies, corruption that implicated people close to President Grant, and Grant had punished him for it by initially removing him from command of the 1876 expedition. Custer had gone to Washington, humiliated himself, begged, and eventually been restored to command through the intervention of General Terry, but the episode had made clear how precarious his position was. His political ambitions, and there had been real ambitions, a possible run for the presidency as a Democrat, were stalling. His reputation needed burnishing. He needed a victory. A spectacular, undeniable, front-page victory of the kind that would remind America who George Armstrong Custer was. The summer campaign against the hostile bands offered exactly that opportunity. This is the context in which everything that followed must be understood. Custer was not simply a cavalry commander executing a military mission in the summer of 1876. He was a man with a great deal to prove, a man who measured his career by the column inches in newspapers, a man for whom glory was not a fringe benefit of military service, but its entire purpose. And ambition of that kind, in command of that kind of situation, is dangerous in ways that no amount of tactical skill can fully compensate for. The man who stood against Custer was as different from him as any two human beings could be while occupying the same place and time. Sitting Bull was 45 years old in 1876, a man of the Hunkpapa Lakota, one of the 7 Lakota bands, and he had been a leader in the fullest possible sense of that word for most of his adult life. He was not a chief in the way that word is usually understood. The Lakota had no kings, no hereditary rulers, no single person whose authority extended automatically over all the others. Leadership among the Lakota was earned through demonstrated ability, through generosity, through wisdom and counsel and courage in battle, through the spiritual power that came from living in right relationship with the world. Sitting Bull had all of these qualities, and he had them in such abundance and with such consistency over so many years that by 1876, he had achieved something unprecedented. He had become the acknowledged leader not just of his own band, but of the entire coalition of Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho bands that had refused reservation life. This was not a small thing. Getting 7 distinct Lakota bands plus the Northern Cheyenne and other groups to agree on a common course of action required exactly the kind of political genius that Sitting Bull possessed, and that history has consistently undervalued because it happened to come in a form that white America of the 1870s was incapable of recognizing as genius. In the spring of 1876, as the Army's 3-pronged campaign was being organized, Sitting Bull called a sun dance. The sun dance was the most sacred ceremony of the Plains tribes, a multi-day ritual of fasting and prayer and physical sacrifice in which the participants offered their pain and endurance as prayers for their people. During his sun dance, Sitting Bull cut 100 pieces of flesh from his arms and prayed for a vision. What he received was a vision of soldiers falling from the sky into the Lakota camp like grasshoppers, falling upside down, their hats tumbling before them. He interpreted this as a promise of victory. The news of the vision spread through the gathering camps. Thousands of people who had come together for this ceremony from across the northern plains, and it strengthened the resolve of those who had decided that this summer they would fight rather than run. Then there was Crazy Horse. If Sitting Bull was the political and spiritual center of the resistance, Crazy Horse was its military heart. He was in his mid-30s in 1876, an Oglala Lakota, and he was regarded by his contemporaries and by most serious military historians as one of the genuinely great tactical commanders of his era. He was an unusual man even among his own people. He was notably light in coloring, with brownish hair and lighter skin than most Lakota, and he kept himself apart from the normal social life of the village in ways that people found both strange and compelling. He had never allowed himself to be photographed. He had never signed a treaty. He had fought the army repeatedly over the previous decade, and he had never lost. He understood cavalry tactics with an intuitive clarity that most professional cavalry officers spent years trying to develop. He understood how to use terrain, how to create crossfire, how to lure an enemy into a position from which there was no good escape. He understood, in other words, exactly the things that George Armstrong Custer did not understand he needed to worry about. These 3 men, Custer, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, were moving toward each other across the Montana plains in June of 1876, each representing a world that had no room left for the other, and the collision between them would produce a moment so violent and so complete and so disturbing in its implications that the country has been arguing about what it meant ever since. The 7th Cavalry departed Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17, 1876, and the departure was exactly the kind of spectacle that Custer loved, and that his wife Elizabeth watched from the fort's walls with the particular mixture of pride and dread that military wives have always known. 600 men, 12 companies of cavalry, 40 scouts drawn from the Iroquois and Crow nations who were traditional enemies of the Lakota, civilian packers and guides, a herd of mules carrying supplies. The regimental band played Gary Owen, the 7th's fighting song, as they rode out. It was a tremendous sight. The column stretched for miles across the flat Dakota plain, and the early morning light caught the brass of the instruments and the steel of the carbines, and it all looked very impressive and very powerful, and not at all like men riding toward their deaths. Each trooper carried 100 rounds of ammunition for his Springfield carbine, a single-shot breech-loading rifle that was the standard cavalry weapon of the era. He also carried 24 rounds for his Colt revolver. This was considered a generous supply for a frontier campaign. The army expected the fighting, if there was fighting, to be brief. The warriors, as they always had in the army's experience, would engage, take losses, and flee. The cavalry would pursue, and the campaign would end in captures and surrenders and the removal of the hostile bands to the reservation. That was how it had always worked. That was how it was going to work this time. The 7th Cavalry moved west and then north, following the route that Terry had laid out, moving toward the Yellowstone River where the steamboat Far West would resupply them, and then further west toward the Little Bighorn Valley where the scouts believed the hostile bands were gathered. General Crook's column, coming north from Wyoming, was supposed to be pressing the hostiles from the south, compressing them toward the other two forces. But something had happened to Crook that the rest of the army didn't know about yet. On June 17th, 8 days before the disaster at the Little Bighorn, Crook's column had been hit hard on Rosebud Creek by a large force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors led by Crazy Horse. The Battle of the Rosebud had lasted 6 hours. Crook's force, over 1,000 men, had been fought to a standstill by a warrior force estimated at between 800 and 1,500. Crook had suffered significant casualties and had been forced to pull back and go into camp. He sent word to headquarters and waited for reinforcements and resupply. He did not advance. The southern arm of the three-pronged trap was broken. But Terry and Custer didn't know this. The communications between the widely separated columns were slow and unreliable, dependent on couriers riding across hundreds of miles of wilderness, and the news of Crook's setback had not yet reached Terry when he made his final plans. The entire strategic plan was built on a foundation that had already collapsed, but the men implementing it didn't know it. On June 21st, Terry met with Custer and Gibbon on the deck of the Far West steamboat on the Yellowstone River and laid out the final operation plan. Custer would take the 7th Cavalry south along the Rosebud Creek and then west toward the Little Bighorn, approaching the suspected village location from the south and east. Gibbon would move up the Bighorn River from the north and west, positioning himself to block any escape in that direction. The plan called for the two forces to converge on the village at approximately the same time, ideally catching the hostile bands between them. Terry offered Custer reinforcements, 2 additional cavalry companies from Gibbon's command. Custer declined. Terry offered Custer the 3 Gatling guns, rapid-firing weapons that could have provided enormous firepower advantage. Custer declined. Too slow, he said. They would slow the column's march. These decisions have been debated for 150 years, and they deserve to be debated, because they reveal something essential about Custer's state of mind going into what would be the final campaign of his life. He didn't want the extra companies because extra companies meant sharing credit. He didn't want the Gatling guns because fast movement was more important to him than firepower, and fast movement was important because he was afraid the village would scatter before he could catch it, which would mean no victory and no headlines. These were not tactical decisions. They were decisions driven by ambition and ego, and they would cost 210 men their lives. Terry gave Custer written orders that contained a critical phrase. The orders said Custer should be guided by the developments and information discovered during the march, exercising his own judgment. This language gave Custer discretionary authority, and Custer would use that authority in ways that Terry never intended. As the council on the Far West broke up, Gibbon called after Custer with a phrase that would become famous. "Don't be greedy, Custer. Wait for us." Custer laughed and waved and rode away. The 7th Cavalry moved out on June 22nd, and for the first day the march was routine. The country was beautiful in the way that the northern plains are beautiful in summer, enormous sky and golden grass, and the smell of sage and the constant wind. The column moved through it steadily, and the scouts ranged ahead and to the sides, reading the ground. What the scouts were finding as the days passed should have alarmed Custer profoundly. The trail they were following, the physical evidence of the movement of the hostile bands, was getting bigger. Not a small trail from a few hundred people moving across the landscape. A massive trail, the kind of trail that only thousands of people and thousands of horses could make. The grass was stripped for miles on either side. Camping places showed fire circles in numbers that defied easy counting. Abandoned campsites showed the debris of an enormous village. The Iroquois scouts read this evidence clearly and told Custer what it meant. More people than they had expected. Many more. Custer pushed on. On the night of June 23rd, the column camped at the abandoned Sundance site, where Sitting Bull had received his vision. The Iroquois scouts examined the site and found things that troubled them deeply. A buffalo robe painted with images they interpreted as a prophecy of battle. Drawings in the sand that seemed to show soldiers falling into a circle of Lakota warriors. Mounds of sand arranged in a pattern. They told Custer what they believed these signs meant. There was going to be a great fight, and the result was already known to the Lakota. Custer did not take this seriously. He was not a man who took omens seriously. He was a man who took newspaper columns seriously, and newspaper columns would be written about the victory he was going to win, not about sand drawings and buffalo robes. Before dawn on June 24th, Custer pushed the column forward again, driven by intelligence suggesting the hostile village was close. That evening, as the column rested in the valley of Ash Creek, Custer's chief of scouts, Lieutenant Charles Varnum, climbed to a high point in the Wolf Mountains called the Crow's Nest. In the early light of June 25th, the scouts who had come up with Varnum looked west across the Little Bighorn Valley and saw what they had feared. The pony herd. The Lakota pony herd was so vast that from the Crow's Nest, miles away, it appeared as a dark mass spread across the valley floor, constantly moving, like a swarm of insects seen from a distance. Simple arithmetic told the story. Plains tribes typically maintained a ratio of several horses per person. A herd of that size meant a village of that size. Scout Bloody Knife, who had ridden with Custer before and understood him well, looked at the herd, and then looked at his fellow scout Half-Yellow Face and said something that has been repeated ever since. "We will find enough Sioux to keep us fighting for 2 or 3 days. Half-Yellow Face's reply was darker. He said they would all be dead by sundown. When Varnum sent word to Custer, and Custer climbed to the Crow's Nest to look for himself, something happened that has puzzled historians ever since. Custer said he couldn't see what his scouts were describing. He looked through binoculars at the valley below and reported that he could not make out the pony herd. His scouts insisted it was there. He maintained he couldn't see it. Whether this was deteriorating eyesight, which some historians have suggested, or whether it was a deliberate performance of skepticism designed to justify a decision he had already made regardless of what the scouts reported, is impossible to know. What is known is the outcome. Custer rejected the scouts' assessment. He chose to believe that the hostile camp was smaller than the evidence suggested. He chose to believe that he faced a manageable opponent. And then, before he had even confirmed the location or size of the village, events accelerated in a way that Custer used to justify the most fateful decision of his career. Word came that a small group of warriors had found the 7th Cavalry supply cache and discovered the column's presence. The Indians knew they were coming. Custer made the decision immediately. They would attack now. Not wait for Gibbon. Not wait for additional information. Not wait for a coordinated approach from multiple directions. Now, before the village could scatter, before the warriors could run, before someone else could get there first and take the glory, he divided his regiment. He sent Captain Benteen south and west with 3 companies and 125 men, ostensibly to scout for escaping warriors, but effectively removing a significant portion of his force from the coming fight. He sent Major Reno south toward the village with 3 companies and 130 men, ordering him to attack and pursue the fleeing warriors. He kept 5 companies and 210 men under his own direct command. The pack train with the ammunition reserves and another company stayed behind. It was the most consequential set of decisions in the history of the American frontier wars. As the 3 separate forces moved off in their 3 separate directions, the Iroquois scouts sang their death songs. This was not metaphor. This was not ceremony. They were singing the songs that Iroquois warriors sang when they knew they were going to die. Scout Curley, a Crow, would later testify that he told Custer directly that there were more Sioux than there were bullets for them to fire. Custer laughed. He told his scouts they were cowards. Some of the scouts rode away. They refused to go further. The 7th Cavalry moved toward the Little Bighorn. The temperature was climbing toward 90 degrees. The horses were tired from hard marching on short rations. The men were tired. The ammunition was distributed, 100 rounds per man, less than the standard 150 because the extra had been left with the pack train to save weight and increase speed. 2,500 warriors waited in the valley ahead. They were not frightened. They were not planning to run. They had seen Custer's vision in Sitting Bull's dream, soldiers falling from the sky, and they were ready to make the dream real. The collision that would shatter the myth of cavalry supremacy and write one of the most dramatic and disturbing chapters in American military history was less than 6 hours away. The valley of the Little Bighorn on the afternoon of June 25, 1876, was one of the most beautiful places on earth, and it was about to become one of the most terrible. The river itself was not a large river by Western standards, maybe 40 to 60 feet across in most places, moving at a steady current through a valley flanked by bluffs on the east side and broad, open bottomland on the west. Cottonwood trees grew thick along the banks. and beyond them the grass stretched out flat and green toward the river's western edge where the enormous village stood. The village ran along the west bank of the Little Bighorn for approximately 3 miles, and it was organized not randomly, but with careful attention to the traditional relationships between the bands. At the southern end, closest to the direction from which Major Reno was approaching, stood the Hunkpapa Circle, Sitting Bull's people. Moving north along the river, one would pass through the Mini-Conja camp, then the Sans Arc, then the Oglala under Crazy Horse, and at the northern end the Northern Cheyenne under chiefs like Two Moon and Lame White Man. Between and among these circles were smaller groups, Blackfoot Sioux and Brule, and some Arapaho, who had come to join the great gathering. And everywhere there were people, women cooking over fires and scraping hides and watching children. Old men sitting in the shade of the lodges telling stories. Young men tending to horses or gambling or resting in the heat of the afternoon. Dogs barking. Children running. The sounds of a community going about its daily life. Completely ordinary and completely human. And among all those people were the warriors, the fighting men, relaxed but not unaware, because they knew the soldiers were coming. They had known for days. Their scouts had been watching the 7th Cavalry's movements. Sitting Bull's vision had told them what to expect. The question was not whether the soldiers would come, but when, and now the answer was now. Major Marcus Reno was not a coward, whatever Elizabeth Custer would later claim. He was a Civil War veteran who had served competently, if not brilliantly, through some of the hardest fighting of that war, and he had risen to the rank of Brevet Brigadier General before the peacetime reduction brought him back down to Major. He was 40 years old, a career officer, a man who did his job without particular distinction or particular failure, and he had been given a task that would have been difficult for any commander and was going to prove impossible for him. Custer's orders to Reno were simple. Take your 3 companies, cross the Little Bighorn, and charge the village from the south. The Indians will run. Drive them north toward my position, and we will catch them between us. That was the plan. It assumed the Indians would run. Reno formed his battalion, Companies A, G, and M, approximately 130 men plus the Iroquois scouts, and they moved down the valley of Ash Creek, which the soldiers called Reno Creek, toward the Little Bighorn. They crossed the river at a ford that the scouts had identified, and the horses splashed through the water and came up on the west bank, and the men formed into a line of battle in the flat bottomland between the river and the village. It was approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was high and hot. The dust from the horses hung in the still air, and Reno gave the order to charge. 130 cavalrymen thundered forward across the valley floor, 3 companies abreast, guidons snapping in the wind of their own movement, and for a few hundred yards it must have looked exactly like every other cavalry charge against a native village. The horses galloped. The men shouted. The ground shook. And then the village reacted, and everything Custer had promised would happen did not happen. The warriors did not flee. They came out to fight. Not a few warriors. Not scattered resistance. Hundreds of them, pouring out of the southern end of the village like water from a broken dam, mounted and on foot, armed with rifles and bows, spreading out across the front of Reno's charge in a line that grew wider and deeper with every passing second. The Hunkpapa warriors were the first to respond because they were the closest. Among them was a warrior named Gall, a war chief of enormous physical presence and tactical ability. Gall had personal reasons to fight with particular fury that afternoon. During Reno's initial charge, or perhaps in the moments just before it, Gall's 2 wives and 3 of his children were killed. Whether they were killed by cavalry gunfire or by the Iroquois scouts who accompanied Reno and who set fire to some lodges at the edge of the village is debated by historians. What is not debated is the effect on Gall. He went into the fight with a grief so enormous and so raw that it expressed itself as pure lethal rage, and he channeled that rage into military action with devastating effectiveness. Reno's charge covered perhaps 3/4 of a mile before it stopped. The warriors in front of him were not running. They were multiplying. More and more fighters emerged from the village, and they were not doing what the army expected them to do. They were spreading to the left, to the west, flanking Reno's line, threatening to get behind him and cut off his retreat to the river. Reno made his first critical decision. He halted the charge. The momentum that was the cavalry's greatest weapon in an attack died instantly. Horses that had been galloping came to confused, stamping stops. Men looked around at each other. The warriors kept coming. Reno ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line, the standard defensive formation for dismounted cavalry. Every fourth man held the horses while the other three spread out in a line and began firing. This reduced his effective fighting force by 25% instantly. Instead of 130 men in the fight, he had roughly 100, spread across a thin line in open ground, facing a growing mass of warriors who outnumbered them and were increasing their advantage by the minute. The skirmish line held for perhaps 20 minutes. The men fired their Springfield carbines steadily, aimed shots at warriors who appeared and disappeared in the tall grass and the smoke with maddening unpredictability. The Springfield was an accurate weapon at range, and the soldiers were trained marksmen, and some of the shooting was effective. But the Springfield had a critical weakness. It was a single-shot weapon. Each time a trooper fired, he had to open the breech, extract the spent cartridge case, insert a new round, close the breech, cock the hammer, aim, and fire again. A trained soldier could manage this in perhaps 8 to 10 seconds under ideal conditions. Under combat conditions, with hands shaking and dust in the eyes and warriors advancing from multiple directions, it took longer. In those seconds between shots, a man with a Winchester repeating rifle could fire 3, 4, 5 rounds. And many of the warriors had Winchesters. They had Henry rifles. They had weapons that could fire 15 or 16 rounds without reloading. Weapons they had obtained through trade and purchase and battlefield capture over the preceding years. Weapons that the Army in its institutional arrogance had assumed the natives did not possess in significant numbers. The Army was wrong. Archaeological evidence recovered from the battlefield over the following century would demonstrate conclusively that the warriors were better armed than the soldiers. Not just in some cases. In many cases, the repeating rifles gave them a rate of fire advantage that more than compensated for any superiority in training or discipline that the cavalry possessed. As the skirmish line burned through ammunition and the warriors pressed closer, Reno made his second critical decision. He pulled his men back into the timber along the river. The cottonwood grove offered cover from the incessant fire, and the dense brush broke up the warriors' ability to coordinate their attacks. For a few minutes, the timber provided a defensible position. The soldiers took cover behind trees and fallen logs and returned fire. But the timber was a trap as much as a refuge. The brush was so thick that officers couldn't see their men. Commands couldn't be heard over the gunfire. Units mixed together. The organized companies that had crossed the river in formation were becoming a disorganized mass of individual soldiers fighting individually, which is exactly what a military force should never become. And then the moment came that broke Reno. He was standing near the edge of the timber, trying to assess the situation, when the head of his favorite scout, Bloody Knife, exploded. A bullet struck Bloody Knife in the skull at close range, and his blood and brain matter sprayed across Reno's face and uniform. Reno stood there, dripping with a dead man's brain, and something inside him cracked. Whether it was the physical shock of the experience or the accumulated stress of the afternoon or the dawning realization that Custer's promise of fleeing Indians was catastrophically wrong, Reno lost his ability to command. He gave an order to mount. Then he gave an order to dismount. Then he gave an order to mount again. Men looked at each other in confusion. The warriors pressed closer. Gunfire intensified. Men were falling. Then Reno screamed the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. All those who wish to make their escape, follow me. Not retreat. Not withdraw to better ground. Escape. He spurred his horse out of the timber and headed for the river at a gallop. Some men followed immediately. Others never heard the order. Others were too engaged with the warriors to break contact. The organized military force that had crossed the Little Bighorn 45 minutes earlier ceased to exist in that moment. What followed was not a retreat. It was a rout. A disorganized mass of terrified men on terrified horses crashing through the brush and across the open ground between the timber and the river, while warriors on horseback pursued them and cut them down. The distance from the timber to the river crossing was perhaps 1,000 yards. In those 1,000 yards, the 7th Cavalry's reputation died. Warriors rode alongside the fleeing soldiers, pulling men from their horses. Arrows and bullets struck from every direction. Men who fell from their horses were killed where they lay. The wounded who couldn't ride were abandoned. There was no covering fire. There was no organized rearguard. There was nothing but panic. The river crossing itself became a killing ground of particular horror. The banks were steep in places, and horses balked and reared at the edge. Men piled up behind each other, creating dense targets. Warriors fired from both banks. Soldiers and horses tumbled into the water together. The current was not strong, but it was strong enough to pull a wounded man under. The water turned pink and then red. Men clawed at the far bank, pulling themselves up the steep bluff, horses scrambling, equipment abandoned, weapons dropped, all order gone. Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson was hit in the leg as he crossed the river. His horse was killed. He grabbed the stirrup of another trooper's horse and was dragged partway up the far bank before a bullet killed him. His body tumbled back into the water. Scout Isaiah Dorman, a black man who had lived among the Lakota and spoke their language, was wounded and left behind at the river crossing. He was killed, though accounts differ about the circumstances. Some Lakota accounts say he fought bravely and was treated with respect in death. Others describe a more brutal end. What is certain is that he died there at the water's edge, one of the forgotten casualties of that terrible afternoon. Of the approximately 130 men who had crossed the Little Bighorn with Reno, roughly 40 were killed, wounded, or missing in those 30 minutes of fighting. The survivors scrambled up the bluffs on the east side of the river and found themselves on a hilltop that offered some defensive advantage. It was not a good position. It was simply the only position available. The hilltop was exposed to fire from higher ground nearby. There was no water. The grass was dry and could be set on fire. But it was the best they could do, and they began digging in with whatever tools they had, which was almost nothing, and they waited for the attack they knew was coming. Reno was barely functional. His face was still covered in bloody knife's blood. His eyes had the blank, glazed look of a man in shock. Officers later testified that he was drinking from a whiskey flask. Whether the whiskey caused his breakdown or was an attempt to self-medicate after it had already occurred is another question that has never been fully resolved. What is clear is that effective command on Reno Hill devolved to the company commanders and the non-commissioned officers who did what soldiers have always done when leadership fails. They led themselves. Captain Thomas Weir was one of the officers on Reno Hill, and as the afternoon progressed and the sounds of heavy firing came from the north, from the direction Custer had gone, Weir became increasingly agitated. He wanted to move toward the sound of the guns, the fundamental military principle that when you hear your comrades fighting, you go to help them. Reno refused. His men were barely organized. They were low on ammunition. Warriors were still probing their position. To move north would mean abandoning their defensive position and marching into an unknown situation. Weir eventually took his company and moved north on his own, without orders, and from a high point later named Weir Point he looked north toward the ridges where Custer had gone. What he saw made him turn around and ride back as fast as he could. The ridges were covered with warriors, thousands of them, moving among what appeared to be fallen soldiers. No blue uniforms were standing. No cavalry formations were visible. Only warriors, and the distant sounds of celebration. Weir understood instantly what this meant. Custer was gone. Meanwhile, Captain Frederick Benteen had been carrying out his assigned mission to the south and west, scouting for warriors who might be fleeing the village in that direction. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The warriors were not fleeing. They were fighting. The entire mission was pointless, a waste of 125 men at the moment when every rifle mattered. Benteen received Custer's final message, carried by trumpeter John Martin, the last white man to see Custer's battalion alive. The message was written hastily on a scrap of paper by Custer's adjutant, Lieutenant William Cook, whose handwriting was shaky with urgency. It read, "Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. W.W. Cook. P.S. Bring packs." The postscript, underlined, repeated the plea for ammunition. Bring packs meant bring the pack mules carrying the ammunition reserves. Custer was already running low. Martin, an Italian immigrant whose real name was Giovanni Martini and whose English was limited, could add little to the written message. He told Benteen that the Indians were running, which was what he had been told to say, and which was already wildly untrue by the time he said it. Benteen moved toward Reno Hill rather than toward Custer. When he arrived, He found Reno's shattered command and made the decision that would save the survivors and doom Custer's men. He stayed with Reno. There are those who have argued for 150 years that Benteen should have pressed on toward Custer, that the message said come on and be quick, and that was an order from a superior officer and Benteen was duty-bound to obey it. There are others who argue that Benteen assessed the situation correctly, that moving toward Custer with 125 men through a valley swarming with warriors would have accomplished nothing except adding 125 more names to the list of dead. The truth is probably that Benteen made a defensible military decision in an impossible situation, and that it would not have mattered anyway. By the time Benteen reached Reno Hill, Custer's battalion was already being destroyed. The timeline that follows is reconstructed from physical evidence, native testimony, and military investigation, because there were no white survivors of what happened on those ridges to the north. Not one. Every account of Custer's final fight comes from the warriors who killed his men or from the archaeological evidence recovered from the ground itself. The story of Custer's last hour has been pieced together like a broken vase, fragment by fragment, and while the broad outlines are now reasonably well established, the specific details of those final minutes retain an element of irreducible uncertainty that gives them a terrible, haunted quality. What we know is this. After separating from Reno at the river, Custer took his 5 companies, approximately 210 men, and moved north along the bluffs on the east side of the Little Bighorn. His initial intention appears to have been to find a crossing point further north, to hit the village from the flank or rear, while Reno's attack held the warriors' attention to the south. This was standard cavalry tactics against native villages, the kind of double envelopment that had worked at the Washita in 1868 when Custer had attacked Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp. But the Washita had been a dawn attack on a sleeping village in winter. This was an afternoon attack on an alert village in summer. The warriors were not sleeping. They were fighting, and they were winning. As Custer moved north along the ridgeline, he would have been able to see portions of the valley below, and what he saw must have begun to alarm him. The village was enormous. It stretched for miles along the river, and Reno's attack, which was supposed to keep the warriors occupied, was clearly failing. The sounds from the south told the story, heavy firing that intensified and then suddenly moved, indicating retreat, and then the firing became scattered and distant, which meant Reno's men were running. Custer sent the message to Benteen. Come on, big village. Be quick. Bring packs. Then he kept moving north. At some point, probably around 3:45 in the afternoon, Custer's battalion reached a point on the bluffs that later investigation would identify as Medicine Tail Coulee, a ravine that led down from the ridge to a ford across the Little Bighorn. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in American military history. Some accounts, primarily from Cheyenne sources, describe 2 companies of cavalry, possibly companies E and F, riding down Medicine Tail Coulee toward the river. Warriors hidden in the brush and behind the riverbank opened fire. The crossing was blocked. The companies fell back. Other accounts suggest that only a smaller force, perhaps a scouting party, reached the river and was driven back. What is clear from the archaeological evidence is that the initial contact between Custer's battalion and the warriors defending the northern part of the village occurred in the area of Medicine Tail Coulee, and that the contact was violent and unsuccessful from the Army's perspective. Custer could not cross the river. The warriors were not running. They were massed on the opposite bank and in the brush along the water, firing with devastating effect. Custer pulled back. He moved his battalion further north along the ridgeline, probably looking for better ground, a defensive position from which he could hold until Benteen arrived with reinforcements and ammunition. But the ridge offered no good defensive positions. The terrain was a series of rolling hills and shallow ravines, open ground with sparse cover, ground that a military tactician would recognize immediately as unsuitable for a defensive stand by a small force against a larger one. And the larger force was coming. From the south, Gall's warriors, having finished with Reno's shattered command, were now moving north along the river and up the ravines toward Custer's position. From the north and west, Crazy Horse was gathering warriors for the flanking movement that would seal the battalion's fate. The warriors were not attacking in a disorganized rush. They were executing a coordinated tactical plan, pressing from multiple directions simultaneously, using terrain to conceal their movements, concentrating fire on critical points. This was not the wild, undisciplined fighting that the army expected from savages. This was sophisticated light cavalry warfare conducted by men who had been fighting their entire lives and who understood the ground they were fighting on with an intimacy that the soldiers could not match. Custer's battalion began taking fire from multiple directions as it moved along the ridge. The fire was not heavy at first, sporadic shots from warriors who were probing the column's flanks, testing for weaknesses, feeling out the deployment. But it was constant and it was unnerving, and it was coming from places where the soldiers could not see their attackers. Warriors used the ravines and draws that cut through the ridge to move close to the soldiers unseen, rising to fire and then dropping back into concealment before return fire could be directed at them. This was the terrain advantage that Crazy Horse understood and that Custer had not considered. The ridge was not high ground in any meaningful tactical sense. It was a series of rolling swells cut by deep gullies that provided cover and concealment for an attacker and none for a defender. Every military advantage that cavalry traditionally possessed, mobility, firepower, shock action, was being neutralized by the terrain and by the enemy's superior knowledge of it. As the battalion moved north, it began to fragment. The 5 companies could not maintain cohesion while taking fire from multiple directions. The terrain itself separated them, ridges and ravines breaking the visual connection between units. Officers could not see what was happening to adjacent companies. Orders shouted into the wind, and the gunfire were lost. The organized column that had marched away from the river was becoming a series of isolated groups, each fighting its own separate battle. Company L under Lieutenant James Calhoun and Company C under Captain Tom Custer, George's brother, were the rearmost units. They deployed on a rise later called Calhoun Hill, probably ordered to form a defensive line to cover the rest of the battalion as it moved north. It was a reasonable tactical decision. Hold the rear. Buy time. Let the other companies find good ground. On Calhoun Hill, Lieutenant Calhoun deployed his men in textbook fashion. They dismounted. Every 4th man held the horses. The rest spread out in a skirmish line facing south and east, toward the direction from which the heaviest fire was coming. They began firing measured, aimed shots at the warriors pressing up from the ravines below. For a few minutes, Calhoun's position held. The Springfield carbines were accurate at range, and the soldiers on the hilltop had a clear field of fire. Warriors who exposed themselves took casualties. The defense was working. And then Gaul arrived with the main body of warriors from the south, hundreds of fighters who had just finished routing Reno's command and were now flushed with victory and burning for more. Gaul hit Calhoun Hill from the south and east. The volume of fire increased dramatically. Warriors with repeating rifles poured rounds into the skirmish line from multiple positions. The soldiers returned fire, one shot at a time from their single-shot Springfields, could not match the rate. In the time it took a trooper to fire one aimed round, extract the spent case, reload, and fire again, a warrior with a Winchester could fire 4 or 5 shots. The mathematics of the engagement were lethal and inescapable. But it was not just the rate of fire that destroyed Calhoun's position. It was what happened to the horses. The holders, every 4th man, were stationed behind the skirmish line with the company's mounts. Warriors targeted them deliberately. When a holder went down, 3 or 4 horses broke free and stampeded. Loose horses created chaos. They ran through the skirmish line, disrupting the formation. They provided momentary cover for advancing warriors. And they deprived the soldiers of their only means of rapid movement, their ability to retreat to another position or to charge. Without horses, dismounted cavalry was simply infantry, slow infantry, in the open against a faster, more mobile enemy. Company C, positioned near Calhoun's company, was hit simultaneously. Captain Tom Custer, who had won 2 Medals of Honor during the Civil War for capturing Confederate battle flags, tried to maintain his company's cohesion. But the fire was coming from too many directions. Men began bunching together, clustering into tight groups, the instinctive response of terrified human beings seeking the psychological comfort of proximity to others. This instinct, so natural and so human, was tactically catastrophic. Bunched men made easy targets. Warriors concentrated their fire on the clusters and killed multiple soldiers with concentrated volleys. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1980s found cartridge casings clustered in tight groups on Calhoun Hill and the surrounding area, physical evidence of soldiers who were no longer spreading out in skirmish lines, but huddling together in fear. The metal detectors also found something else. By tracking the distinctive firing pin marks on spent cartridges, archaeologists could identify individual weapons and trace their movements across the battlefield. What they found was devastating to the heroic last stand narrative. The soldiers' weapons stayed in tight clusters. The men were not maneuvering. They were standing or crouching in place, firing rapidly, burning through ammunition. The warriors' weapons, by contrast, showed movement. Individual rifles could be traced from position to position, moving forward, always forward, closing the distance, working around the flanks. The warriors were maneuvering. The soldiers were not. This is the fundamental tactical reality of the battle that the myth has always obscured. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fought a tactically superior battle. They used terrain. They used their mobility. They concentrated fire. They coordinated their movements. They exploited every advantage the ground and the situation offered them. And the soldiers, leaderless and terrified and running out of ammunition, could not respond effectively. The destruction of Calhoun's and Tom Custer's companies took less than 10 minutes. Archaeological evidence suggests it may have been as fast as 7 minutes from the moment Gaull's warriors hit them in force to the moment the last man fell. 7 minutes. In 7 minutes, approximately 50 soldiers died. Their bodies were found on and around Calhoun Hill in patterns that told the story of collapse. Some died in their skirmish positions, shot down while firing. Others died running north, toward the rest of the battalion, their bodies marking the path of their flight. One soldier's remains were found 400 yards from Calhoun Hill, the farthest anyone made it before being caught. An arrowhead was embedded in his spine. He had been running when he was hit from behind. The warriors who killed Calhoun's men did not stop to celebrate. They moved north, following the fleeing survivors, gathering momentum. Every dead soldier meant another weapon captured, another handful of ammunition taken, another horse seized. The warriors were growing stronger as the soldiers grew weaker. This is one of the most important and most overlooked dynamics of the battle. In most military engagements, both sides lose strength as the fight progresses. At the Little Bighorn, only one side was losing strength. The warriors were gaining it. Captain Miles Keogh's company, I was positioned on a rise between Calhoun Hill and the higher ground to the north where Custer was moving. Keogh was Irish-born, a veteran of the Papal Wars in Italy before he came to America and fought for the Union in the Civil War. He wore a Catholic medal, the Agnus Dei, around his neck, and he was one of the most experienced and capable officers in the regiment. When Calhoun's position collapsed, Keogh tried to hold his ground. His men dismounted and formed a defensive line. They fired 2 disciplined volleys into the mass of warriors surging up from the south. For a moment, it seemed like the line might hold. Then Crazy Horse appeared. The great Oglala War leader had spent the opening phase of the battle gathering warriors to the north and west of Custer's position. While Gaull attacked from the south, Crazy Horse had swung wide, circling behind the ridgeline, and now he struck from the north and west like a thunderbolt. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Keogh's men were already engaged to the south, when hundreds of warriors appeared behind them and to their left, firing from ravines and draws that the soldiers hadn't even known were there. The position became untenable in seconds. The crossfire was murderous. Men fell rapidly. The formation broke. Soldiers who moments before had been firing disciplined volleys were now turning in circles, trying to find cover, trying to identify threats that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Keogh died with his men. His body was found in a small cluster with several other soldiers, close together, facing outward in a rough circle. The Agnus Dei medal was still around his neck. Lakota accounts say that a warrior tried to take it and was warned away by an elder who said the medal had powerful medicine and should not be disturbed. Whether this is true or whether it was a later embellishment is uncertain, but the medal was found with Keogh's body. Near Keogh's body, they found his horse. Comanche was a bay gelding, not a particularly distinguished animal, but tough and steady, the kind of horse that soldiers depended on. Comanche was found standing on the battlefield 2 days later, alive but terribly wounded. 7 bullets had struck him. He was cut and bleeding from multiple wounds. But he was alive. He was the only living thing the burial parties found on Custer's portion of the field. The horse was nursed back to health by the regiment and became a living symbol of the disaster. For the rest of his life, Comanche was never ridden again. He appeared at 7th Cavalry formations draped in black, an empty saddle on his back, and when he died in 1891, his body was preserved by a taxidermist and can still be seen at the University of Kansas Natural History Museum. He stands there behind glass, a stuffed horse with 7 bullet scars, the only survivor of Custer's last fight. And there is something unbearably sad about that. With Keogh's company destroyed, approximately 120 soldiers were dead. Custer had maybe 90 men left, perhaps fewer. They were moving north along the ridge toward the highest ground available, a gentle rise that would later be called Last Stand Hill. But they were not moving in formation. They were moving in fragments. Small groups of soldiers, the remnants of companies that had lost their officers and their cohesion, stumbled north through the smoke and dust. Some had lost their horses. Some had thrown away their carbines, which were empty or jammed. Some carried only revolvers with 24 rounds or fewer. The warriors were everywhere now. They pressed from the south, following the path of destruction. They appeared from the ravines to the east. They rose from the grass to the west. Crazy Horse's warriors circled from the north. The surviving soldiers were inside a closing ring of fire, and the ring was getting smaller. Somewhere in these minutes, something happened that revealed the final, fatal weakness of the soldiers' weapons. The Springfield carbine had a known defect. In sustained rapid fire, the copper cartridge cases expanded from the heat and sometimes stuck in the chamber. When this happened, the extractor mechanism would tear through the soft copper rim of the cartridge instead of pulling it out, leaving the spent case jammed in the breech and rendering the weapon useless. The only way to clear a jammed Springfield was to pry the stuck case out with a knife blade, a process that took time measured in minutes while warriors with repeating rifles fired at you from closing range. Archaeological evidence found cartridge cases on the battlefield with tool marks on the rims where soldiers had tried desperately to extract jammed rounds. Some had succeeded. Others had not. A soldier with a jammed carbine in the middle of a fight for his life had 2 options. He could try to clear the jam while bullets flew around him, or he could drop the useless weapon and pull his revolver, which gave him 6 shots at effective range and then nothing. Either way, he was dying. The weapons that the United States Army had issued to its cavalry were killing the men who carried them. Not directly, but through a design flaw that manifested at the worst possible moment, when the soldiers needed every round they could fire, and when the enemy was pressing from every direction with weapons that did not jam, that did not require manual extraction of spent cases, that fired as fast as the trigger could be pulled. This is not a minor detail. This is one of the central mechanical facts of the battle. The Springfield carbine was chosen over repeating rifles for the Frontier Army because it used less ammunition per engagement, and the Army's bean counters decided that the cost savings in ammunition justified the reduced rate of fire. Soldiers were expected to fire carefully aimed shots, conserving ammunition, and the single-shot mechanism enforced this discipline. It was a reasonable decision if the enemy cooperated by standing at a distance and offering clear targets. If the enemy did not cooperate, if the enemy charged from multiple directions with superior weapons and superior numbers and superior knowledge of the terrain, the Springfield's economy became a death sentence. At the Little Bighorn, the enemy did not cooperate. As the surviving soldiers pushed toward Last Stand Hill, the battle reached a phase that the Lakota and Cheyenne accounts describe with terrible clarity. The soldiers were no longer fighting as a military force. They were fighting as individuals, as small groups of desperate men trying to survive from one moment to the next. Warriors close to point-blank range. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places. War clubs and knives against revolvers and bare hands. The smoke from burning grass and black powder hung over the ridge in a thick haze, reducing visibility to a few yards in places. Warriors described shooting at muzzle flashes because they could not see the men firing at them. Soldiers fired at movement in the smoke, at shadows, at sounds. The organized military operation that had crossed the divide that morning had been reduced to its most primitive elements. Kill or die, and the soldiers were dying. Approximately 60 men, perhaps more, never made it to Last Stand Hill at all. They broke south and east, away from the heaviest fighting, and plunged down into a steep, narrow ravine that later searchers would call Deep Ravine. They were looking for cover. They were looking for escape. They found neither. Deep Ravine was a natural feature that ran from near the ridgeline down toward the river, steep-sided and narrow, offering concealment from direct fire, but no protection from warriors who positioned themselves on the rim. The soldiers who fled into Deep Ravine died there. 28 bodies were found in one cluster at the bottom of the ravine, piled on top of each other where they had fallen. Some had thrown away their weapons. Some had no ammunition left. Some had wounds that suggested they had been killed while trying to climb the steep sides of the ravine, clawing at the dirt with their hands, trying to escape a killing ground that offered no escape. These were not men making a heroic last stand. These were men in the grip of primal terror, the kind of terror that erases training and discipline and rank and everything else that separates a soldier from a frightened human being running for his life. The Deep Ravine dead would become one of the most troubling aspects of the Little Bighorn story, troubling because they contradicted the myth so completely. The myth required courage. The Deep Ravine showed panic. The myth required soldiers standing firm. The Deep Ravine showed soldiers running. The myth required a last stand. The Deep Ravine showed men dying in a heap, on top of each other, weapons abandoned, formation gone, hope gone. And so the myth simply ignored the Deep Ravine. For 100 years, the Deep Ravine dead were barely mentioned in popular accounts of the battle. They didn't fit the story, so they were excluded from the story. The truth was too ugly for the legend. On Last Stand Hill, the final act was beginning. Custer, if he was still alive at this point, and there is some debate about exactly when he died, gathered perhaps 40 men around him in a rough defensive circle near the top of the rise. Among them were his brother Tom, his nephew Audie Reed, his adjutant Lieutenant William Cook with his magnificent Dundreary whiskers, and the remnants of companies E and F. They killed their remaining horses and used the bodies as breastworks. This was the standard last-ditch defensive tactic of plains warfare, something every frontier soldier knew. Kill your horse. Get behind it. Use its body as a shield and a rifle rest. But dead horses do not stop bullets, and the circle was small, and the warriors were close, and there were so many of them. Tu Moon, a northern Cheyenne chief, described the final moments from the warriors' perspective. We circled all round them, swirling like water around a stone. We shoot, we ride fast, we shoot again. Soldiers drop, and horses drop. We could not see them half the time because of the smoke. The smoke was so thick, he said, that warriors sometimes fired at muzzle flashes because they could not see the men behind them. The final charge came from every direction at once. Warriors who had been firing from a distance rose and rushed the circle. The last soldiers fired their last rounds, and then there was nothing left to fire. Some fought with empty rifles used as clubs. Some pulled knives. Some stood and died. Some may have shot themselves rather than be taken alive, a practice that frontier soldiers were informally trained to consider, because capture by hostile warriors was understood to mean torture. Whether any soldiers at the Little Bighorn were actually tortured is a matter of debate. Post-battle mutilation of bodies was practiced by both sides in the Plains Wars, but mutilation of the dead was different from torture of the living, and most native accounts describe the fighting as ending quickly once the last organized resistance collapsed. The last shots were fired sometime around 4:30 in the afternoon. Perhaps earlier. Perhaps a few minutes later. The exact time is impossible to determine. What is known is that from the moment of first contact between Custer's battalion and the warriors at Medicine Tail Coulee to the moment the last soldier died, no more than 60 minutes elapsed. Some estimates put it at 45 minutes. Some as low as 30. In less than an hour, 210 men were killed. Every single one of them. No wounded. No prisoners. No survivors. The silence that fell over the battlefield when the firing stopped was, according to native accounts, one of the most profound and terrible things any of them had ever experienced. Where minutes before there had been the deafening roar of hundreds of weapons and the screams of men and horses, there was now nothing but the wind and the distant sounds of celebration from the village below. Warriors moved among the bodies, collecting weapons and ammunition and clothing. Some bodies were mutilated, according to warrior tradition and spiritual belief. Arms were cut. Legs were slashed at the tendons. This was not savagery. It was spiritual practice, the belief that mutilating the body of a fallen enemy prevented his spirit from fighting in the afterlife. It was done to brave enemies as a precaution, not to weak ones. Other bodies were left untouched, which could mean different things depending on the context: respect for exceptional bravery, or contempt too deep to bother with. Custer's body was found near the top of Last Stand Hill, lying among the dead. He had 2 wounds. 1 bullet through the left temple, 1 through the left breast. Either would have been fatal. He was not scalped. His hair had been cut short before the campaign and may not have been considered worth taking as a trophy, or the restraint may have reflected something else. Some Lakota accounts say that Custer was not recognized during the battle or immediately afterward, and that the relative lack of mutilation reflected simply that he was not identified as the leader. Other accounts say he was recognized and left unmutilated as a sign of respect or of contempt. The ambiguity is appropriate. Custer's death, like his life, generated stories that cannot be fully reconciled with each other. What is not ambiguous is the result. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was over. George Armstrong Custer and 210 men of the 7th United States Cavalry were dead. And 4 miles to the south, on a hilltop surrounded by warriors, 370 more soldiers huddled in hastily dug rifle pits, waiting for their turn to die. The sun was still high over the Montana hills when the last shots echoed from the ridges to the north, but on Reno Hill the men did not know what that silence meant. They could guess. They had heard the firing build to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very air around them, a sustained roar of hundreds of weapons firing simultaneously, and then it had faded, not gradually the way a battle fades when one side withdraws, but suddenly, the way a fire goes out when there is nothing left to burn. Captain Ware had seen it from his high point to the north, the ridges covered with warriors and no blue uniforms standing, and he had turned his company around and ridden back to Reno Hill with the look of a man who has seen something he will never be able to unsee. He told the other officers what he had observed. The news moved through the defensive perimeter in whispers. Custer is gone. They are all gone. We are alone. The men on Reno Hill understood their situation with perfect and terrible clarity. They were approximately 370 soldiers, scouts, and civilians on an exposed hilltop with limited ammunition, no water, no fortifications, and no prospect of relief for at least 24 hours. Around them, in every direction, were warriors who had just destroyed 5 companies of cavalry in less than an hour and who now had nothing to prevent them from turning their full attention to the survivors on the hill. The mathematics were simple and awful. If the warriors could kill 210 men in 45 minutes on the ridge, what would they do to 370 men on an exposed hilltop over the course of a night and a day? The answer depended on what the survivors did in the next few hours. And what the survivors did was what soldiers have always done when they have no choice left but to dig in and hold. They dug, with whatever they had. Knives, tin cups, mess plates, bare hands. The ground on Reno Hill was hard and dry, baked by the Montana summer, and digging into it with a mess kit was agonizing work. Men scraped shallow depressions in the earth, piling the dirt in front of them as breastworks that would stop nothing larger than an arrow, and they used the bodies of dead horses and mules for additional cover, dragging the heavy carcasses into position around the perimeter. The smell was immediate and terrible in the June heat, the sweet, sick odor of dead animals and dead men, and it would only get worse. Captain Benteen took effective command of the defense. Reno was still nominally in charge, but his capacity for leadership had been shattered at the river crossing when Bloody Knife's brains hit him in the face, and the whiskey flask that he kept pulling from was not restoring it. Benteen was a different kind of man. He was 57 years old, a Civil War veteran who had fought at Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge and a dozen other engagements, a hard-bitten professional soldier who despised Custer personally and would later say so publicly, but who understood his duty and who was capable of extraordinary calm in circumstances that would have broken most men. He walked the perimeter upright while bullets snapped around him, adjusting positions, steadying the men, cursing softly in his distinctive dry manner. When soldiers flinched at incoming fire, Benteen would stand over them and say something like, "Don't worry, boys, that one missed you." and somehow the normality of his tone, the matter-of-fact quality of his voice, made it possible for terrified men to keep functioning. He was not gentle about it. He was not sympathetic. He simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat, and his refusal was contagious. The first serious attack on Reno Hill came before sundown on June 25th. Warriors who had finished with Custer's command moved south in large numbers and began probing the hilltop position from multiple directions. The firing was heavy and sustained. Bullets struck the piled dirt and the horse carcasses and the men behind them. Arrows arced over the breastworks, their trajectories carrying them over cover that would stop a flat-shooting rifle bullet. The warriors knew exactly how to fight a dug in position. They had been doing it for generations. But the soldiers had advantages that Custer's men on the ridge had not possessed. They had cover, poor as it was. They had a concentration of force, 370 men in a compact perimeter instead of 210 spread across a mile of open ridge. They had ammunition, not enough, never enough, but more than Custer's men had carried. And they had time. Time to dig deeper. Time to improve their positions. Time to wait for Terry and Gibbon, who they hoped and prayed were coming from the north. The fighting on the evening of June 25th was fierce but not decisive. The warriors pressed hard but did not mount the kind of overwhelming all-out assault that had destroyed Custer's battalion. There were reasons for this. The warriors had suffered casualties on the ridge, perhaps more than they had expected, and the chiefs were reluctant to spend more lives against a position that was, however weak, at least a prepared defense. The village, with its thousands of women and children, was still in the valley below and still potentially vulnerable. And there was a practical consideration that was purely human. Warriors who had been fighting all afternoon were tired and hungry and wanted to return to their families and rest. The Lakota and Cheyenne did not fight the way European armies fought. They did not sustain attacks through the night as a matter of doctrine. Individual warriors fought when and how they chose, responding to the leadership of men they respected but not bound by orders in the way that soldiers were. A warrior who had fought bravely all day and who wanted to go back to his lodge to eat and tend to his wounds and hold his children was free to do so. This individualism, which was the strength of Plains warfare in many contexts, meant that the overwhelming force that could have overrun Reno Hill was never fully concentrated against it. As darkness fell, the firing slowed but did not stop. Individual warriors kept up a harassing fire through the night, shooting at the hilltop from concealed positions, keeping the soldiers awake, keeping them on edge, ensuring that no one rested. The wounded lay in the center of the perimeter, and their cries were the sound that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Men with shattered limbs and gut wounds and holes in their bodies that bled slowly and steadily through the night, calling for water that no one had. The surgeon, Dr. Henry Porter, worked by touch in the darkness, doing what he could with limited supplies. He had no anesthetic except whiskey. He had no clean bandages. He had almost no instruments. He used his bare hands and his training and his willingness to work through the night without rest, and he saved lives that should have been lost, and he lost lives that should have been saved, and in the morning he looked like a man who had been butchering cattle, covered in blood from his elbows to his fingertips. The thirst was the worst of it. The Montana sun had baked the hilltop all day, and the men had been fighting and digging in temperatures that reached into the 90s. Their canteens were empty. There was no water on the hilltop. The nearest water was the Little Bighorn River at the bottom of a steep bluff, several hundred yards from the perimeter, across open ground that was covered by warrior fire. As the night wore on, the thirst became unbearable. Men's lips cracked. Their tongues swelled. Their throats closed. The wounded begged for water with a desperate, animal intensity that was harder to endure than the gunfire. Some men went mad from it. They tried to drink from puddles of horse blood that pooled around the dead animals in the perimeter. They sucked moisture from grass roots. They chewed on pebbles to stimulate saliva. The human body can survive without food for weeks. Without water in 90-degree heat, while bleeding and terrified, it can begin to shut down in hours. Dawn on June 26th brought renewed attacks. The warriors returned in force with the sunrise, and the firing intensified dramatically. The soldiers, exhausted and dehydrated and haunted by the cries of the wounded, fought back with the grim determination of men who understood that the only alternative to fighting was dying. The perimeter contracted slightly during the morning attacks as warriors pushed closer on the south and east sides. Every inch of ground lost meant less cover and more exposure. Men died at their posts, slumping forward over their little dirt walls, and the men beside them pulled the bodies into the interior and continued firing. Benteen walked the line again and again. He was shot through the heel of his boot at one point, a wound that would have sent most men to the ground, and he barely mentioned it. He kept walking, kept talking, kept holding the defense together through the force of his personality and his absolute refusal to show fear. Sergeant Benjamin Criswell dragged a wounded man to cover under heavy fire and then went back for another. Private Charles Windall fired his Springfield continuously for hours from an exposed position, somehow surviving when men on either side of him were hit. These were acts of extraordinary courage, the kind of courage that exists at the extreme edge of human capability, and they happened because on Reno Hill the alternative to extraordinary courage was death. The crisis of water could not be ignored any longer. By mid-morning on June 26th, the wounded were dying of dehydration as much as their wounds. Dr. Porter told the officers that if water was not obtained, many of the wounded would not survive the day. A volunteer party was organized. 19 men agreed to make the run to the river. They would carry canteens and kettles and anything that would hold water down the steep bluff to the Little Bighorn, fill them, and carry them back up under fire. The distance was not great, perhaps 300 yards each way. But those 300 yards were swept by warrior fire from multiple positions, and every man who volunteered understood that the odds of making the round trip alive were not good. They went anyway, under covering fire from soldiers on the perimeter who concentrated their shots on the warrior positions along the river. The water carriers scrambled down the bluff, exposed and terrified, moving as fast as the terrain would allow. Warriors fired at them from the brush along the riverbank. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet. One man was hit in the arm. Another was hit in the leg. But they reached the water. They filled their containers, the cold, clear water of the Little Bighorn splashing over their hands, and they turned and began the climb back up. The return was worse. Climbing the bluff with heavy water containers while under fire, legs burning, lungs screaming, every step an act of will against the body's desperate desire to drop everything and run. They made it. Not all of them. Some containers were hit by bullets and leaked dry before they reached the top. But enough water reached the hilltop to save the wounded, at least for a few more hours. 15 of the 19 water carriers would later receive the Medal of Honor for their actions that morning. It was the largest single-action award of the Medal of Honor in the Frontier Wars. And every one of those medals was earned in a way that the word heroism barely begins to describe. The water run was repeated several times during the day, each time a gamble, each time some men were hit. But enough water flowed up the hill to keep the wounded alive and to give the fighting men enough to continue functioning. Throughout the day, the siege continued. Warriors maintained fire on the hilltop from multiple directions, but the attacks became less intense as the afternoon progressed. Something was happening in the valley below. The enormous village was moving. From the hilltop, soldiers could see the vast procession beginning to flow south and west. Thousands of people, thousands of horses, the entire community that had gathered along the greasy grass packing up and moving away. The warriors did not break off the siege all at once. The firing continued in diminishing intensity through the afternoon and into the evening. But by nightfall on June 26th, the pressure had eased dramatically. The village was leaving. The warriors were leaving with it. The reasons for the departure were practical. The enormous concentration of people and horses had stripped the valley of grass and game. The village needed to move to find fresh grazing for the pony herd and fresh hunting grounds for the people. And there were reports, accurate reports as it turned out, that more soldiers were coming from the north. Terry and Gibbon were on their way. Sitting Bull and the other chiefs understood that their victory, however complete it was on this one battlefield, had not changed the fundamental reality of their situation. More soldiers would come. They always came. The great gathering would have to break apart, the bands dispersing across the plains, trying to survive the retribution that they knew was coming. On the morning of June 27th, the soldiers on Reno Hill woke to something they had not heard in 2 days. Silence. Real silence. No gunfire. No war cries. No distant drumming. Just the wind across the Montana grass and the soft groaning of the wounded. They waited, not trusting the quiet. Then scouts reported that the valley was empty. The village was gone. Only the blackened circles of old campfires and the detritus of a community in motion remained where thousands of people had lived just hours before. And on the ridges to the north, for miles away, something else remained. Something that no one on Reno Hill wanted to go and see, but that duty required them to face. General Alfred Terry's column arrived at Reno Hill on the morning of June 27th, and the meeting between the relieving force and the survivors was one of those moments in military history that resists adequate description. The men on the hill had been fighting and dying for 2 days. They were dehydrated, exhausted, many of them wounded, all of them traumatized. They were covered in dust and blood and the grime of shallow graves. They looked, according to Terry's officers, like men who had been through a natural disaster, not a military engagement. Terry was a gentle, scholarly man, a lawyer-turned-general who had never wanted a military career, but who had found himself commanding the Department of Dakota and therefore responsible for the campaign that had just produced the worst military disaster in frontier history. He was visibly shaken by what he found on Reno Hill. But what he found on the ridges to the north was worse. The burial parties moved out on the morning of June 28th, and what they encountered defied their capacity to process. The battlefield covered approximately 4 miles of rolling ridgeline and river bottom. Across that 4 miles, 210 bodies lay in the Montana sun. They had been there for 3 days. The temperature had been in the high 80s and 90s. The process of decomposition in that heat is rapid and merciless. The bodies were bloated. Faces were unrecognizable. The skin had turned dark, stretched tight over swelling tissues, and the smell hit the burial parties from hundreds of yards away, a smell that combat veterans of the Civil War, men who had walked the fields of Gettysburg and Antietam, said was worse than anything they had experienced. Many of the bodies had been stripped of their clothing by warriors who took the garments as practical items, boots and shirts and trousers being valuable commodities. Without clothing and without recognizable faces, identification was extremely difficult. Officers were identified by their positions relative to each other, by distinctive personal items, by the testimony of the few scouts who had observed the battle from a distance. Some bodies were never positively identified. Many of the bodies showed evidence of post-mortem mutilation. Arms had been cut. Legs had been slashed. Some bodies had been pierced with arrows after death. Some had been scalped. Some had been dismembered. The mutilation followed patterns that had meaning within Lakota and Cheyenne spiritual tradition. The cutting of limbs to prevent the enemy's spirit from fighting or fleeing in the afterlife. But to the soldiers who found the bodies, it looked like pure savagery, and it confirmed every terrible prejudice they carried about the people they were fighting. What the soldiers did not understand, and what the army never tried to understand, was that mutilation of the enemy dead was not unique to the Plains tribes. During the Civil War, soldiers on both sides had occasionally mutilated enemy corpses. Throughout the frontier wars, white soldiers and settlers had scalped and mutilated native bodies. The practice was brutal and it was human, and it belonged to no single race or culture. But the army needed villains, and the mutilation of the dead provided them. Tom Custer's body was so badly mutilated that he was identified only by a tattoo on his arm, the initials TWC, and an American flag that he had gotten during the Civil War. His face was unrecognizable. His skull had been crushed. Rain in the Face, a Lakota warrior who had publicly sworn to cut out Tom Custer's heart, was later credited with the mutilation, though the truth of this claim is debatable. George Armstrong Custer's body, by contrast, was relatively unmutilated, as previously noted. 2 bullet wounds. No scalping. Some accounts describe a small wound in the ear or the placement of an awl in the ear, which in some interpretations was a message: you did not listen, and now you hear the consequences. But these details are uncertain and may be later embellishments. What is certain is that Custer was dead, lying on that hillside among the men he had led to destruction. The burial was hasty and inadequate. The soldiers had no proper tools. No coffins. No lumber for grave markers beyond rough wooden stakes. They dug shallow graves with the few shovels and picks available, or more often simply scraped depressions in the hard ground with knives and mess kits and piled dirt and sagebrush over the bodies. Many graves were only inches deep. Some bodies were simply covered with brush. Custer's body was wrapped in canvas and given a somewhat deeper grave on Last Stand Hill, but even this was shallow by any standard. The soldiers who performed the burial details were damaged by the experience in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Private Jacob Adams described finding bodies so bloated that they had to be rolled into the shallow graves with poles because no one could bear to touch them. Sergeant John Ryan wrote about the smell in his memoirs decades later, describing it in terms that made clear it had never left his nostrils. The burial was completed in a single day. It was rushed because Terry wanted to move the column away from the battlefield, to evacuate the wounded, to get his demoralized command to safety. He could not know whether the enormous village that had departed might return. He could not know whether other warrior forces might be in the area. He wanted to get his men out, and so the dead were buried quickly and poorly, and the column moved south to the junction of the Little Bighorn and the Bighorn rivers where the steamboat Far West was waiting. The Far West became a floating hospital. Captain Grant Marsh, the vessel's skipper, was one of the most experienced rivermen on the Missouri, and he understood immediately that the wounded needed medical care that could only be obtained at Fort Abraham Lincoln, more than 700 miles downriver. Marsh stripped the boat of everything that wasn't essential, laid the wounded on mattresses of fresh-cut grass on the deck, and began the fastest steamboat run in Missouri River history. 710 miles in 54 hours. Day and night, the little sternwheeler churned downstream, navigating the treacherous upper Missouri by moonlight and instinct. Marsh at the wheel for hours at a stretch, refusing to stop, refusing to slow down, because men were dying on his deck, and the only thing that could save them was speed. The wounded who survived the journey, and most of them did, owed their lives to Grant Marsh's seamanship. It was one of the genuinely heroic acts of the entire campaign, performed not by a soldier, but by a riverboat captain who simply refused to let more men die. The Far West arrived at Fort Abraham Lincoln on July 5, 1876. The day before, July 4th, America had celebrated its centennial with parades and fireworks and speeches about the greatness of the Republic. 100 years of independence, 100 years of progress, 100 years of destiny made manifest. In Philadelphia, the Centennial Exhibition was drawing millions of visitors who marveled at the telephone and the Corliss steam engine and the Remington typewriter. The nation congratulated itself on its achievements. And then the news came. The first reports were fragmentary and confused. Telegraph messages from Fort Abraham Lincoln to the War Department in Washington and then to newspaper offices across the country carried the bare facts. General Custer attacked a large village of hostile Sioux on the Little Bighorn River on June 25th. His command was defeated. General Custer and approximately 260 men are dead. The shock was enormous. America in 1876 was accustomed to frontier violence. The Indian Wars had been going on in various forms for decades, and casualty reports from the West were a regular feature of newspaper coverage. But nothing in the public's experience had prepared them for a disaster of this magnitude. 268 dead, including the most famous Indian fighter in the country, at a time when the nation was celebrating its own invincibility. The timing amplified the impact immeasurably. Centennial celebrations were interrupted by newsboys shouting the headlines. Flags that had been raised in celebration were lowered to half-staff. The mood of national pride curdled into something darker, a mixture of grief and rage and humiliation that demanded explanation and, above all, demanded blame. How could this have happened? How could savages, the newspaper's word, defeat a modern military force? How could America's finest cavalry regiment be destroyed by people the nation was in the process of conquering? The questions carried within them the assumptions that made them unanswerable. If the Lakota and Cheyenne were savages, then their victory was inexplicable and therefore required explanation through treachery, cowardice, overwhelming numbers, anything other than the acknowledgement that they had fought better and smarter than the men sent to subjugate them. If the 7th Cavalry was America's finest, then its destruction could not be attributed to poor leadership or bad decisions, but must be blamed on subordinates who failed their heroic commander. The myth-making began within hours of the first reports. And the first myth-maker, the most determined and the most successful, was Elizabeth Bacon Custer. Elizabeth received the news at Fort Abraham Lincoln on the morning of July 6th. Captain William McCaskey and Dr. J.V.D. Middleton and a small party of officers walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the commanding officer's quarters and knocked on the door. And when Elizabeth opened it, they told her that her husband was dead. She collapsed. She was revived. She was told the details. And then, according to her own account, she insisted on accompanying the officers as they went from house to house on Officers' Row at Fort Abraham Lincoln, telling the wives of other dead officers the same news. 26 women at Fort Abraham Lincoln became widows that morning. Elizabeth wanted to be there when each of them heard it. Whether this was compassion or a need to control the narrative even at the earliest possible moment is a question that can never be fully answered, but the latter interpretation is supported by everything Elizabeth Custer did for the rest of her very long life. She lived for another 57 years. She died in 1933 at the age of 90. And for every one of those 57 years, she devoted herself to a single purpose, ensuring that her husband was remembered as a hero and that the blame for the disaster at the Little Bighorn fell on anyone and everyone except George Armstrong Custer. She wrote 3 books about her life with Custer, each one a carefully crafted piece of myth-making that presented her husband as brave, brilliant, devoted, and betrayed. Boots and Saddles in 1885. Tinting on the Plains in 1887, Following the Guidon in 1890. Each book was a bestseller. Each book reinforced the image of Custer as the golden-haired cavalier, the knight of the plains, the hero whose only flaw was trusting subordinates who proved unworthy of that trust. She gave lectures across the country. She was a compelling speaker, a small woman in widow's black who could hold an audience spellbound with her stories of frontier life and her quiet, devastating indictments of the men she held responsible for her husband's death. She outlived every senior officer of the 7th Cavalry. Reno died in 1889 after being court-martialed and dismissed from the service on unrelated charges. Benteen died in 1898, bitter and alcoholic, having spent his later years writing letters to anyone who would listen about what really happened at the Little Bighorn. By the time the last officers who had been there were dead, Elizabeth's version of events was the only version that most Americans knew, and she defended it with a ferocity that intimidated historians, journalists, and publishers for decades. Anyone who published material critical of Custer risked a lawsuit from Elizabeth's lawyers. Historians who attempted to present a more balanced account were publicly attacked. The effect was chilling. For most of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the story of the Little Bighorn was told in one way and one way only, the way Elizabeth Custer wanted it told. But that story is not what we need to focus on right now. What we need to understand is what happened to the people who won the battle, because their story is where the real tragedy of the Little Bighorn lies. The Lakota and Cheyenne broke camp on the afternoon of June 26th and moved south and west, away from the Little Bighorn Valley. The great gathering that had been the largest concentration of Plains tribes in living memory began to disperse almost immediately. The bands went their separate ways, as they always did after the summer gatherings, moving toward their traditional hunting grounds and winter camps. They took their dead with them. Exactly how many warriors died at the Little Bighorn is one of the questions that will never be answered definitively. Native accounts vary widely. Some accounts claim only a handful of warriors were killed. Others suggest the number was much higher, perhaps 40, perhaps 100, perhaps more. The warriors' bodies were removed from the battlefield by their families, taken to traditional burial sites, placed on scaffolds, or in trees according to custom. The army found very few warrior remains on the field, which fed into the narrative that the soldiers had fought ineffectively, but the absence of bodies reflected cultural practice, not battlefield performance. The warriors had won a tremendous victory, but the victory was hollow in ways they understood even as they celebrated it. Sitting Bull knew. Crazy Horse knew. The elder chiefs who had seen the trajectory of events over the preceding decades knew. Defeating one regiment of cavalry, even destroying it completely, would not stop the army. The army was the instrument of a nation of 40 million people. The Lakota were a nation of perhaps 20,000. The arithmetic was as merciless as it had been on Custer's Ridge, but in reverse. and over a longer timeline. There would be retribution. There would be more soldiers, more campaigns, more pressure. The victory at the Little Bighorn would bring not peace, but a redoubled effort to crush the last free-ranging tribes on the northern plains. And that is exactly what happened. The reaction in Washington was swift and massive. Congress, which had been debating cuts to the military budget, reversed course immediately. Appropriations were increased. Additional cavalry regiments were authorized. Generals who had been cautious about pursuing the hostiles were replaced or pressured into aggressive action. The entire weight of the United States military establishment was directed at a single objective: punish the Lakota and Cheyenne for the Little Bighorn. The campaign that followed was relentless. Through the fall and winter of 1876 and into 1877, military columns crisscrossed the northern plains, attacking villages wherever they found them. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie destroyed Dull Knife's Cheyenne village in November 1876, burning the lodges and the winter food supplies and the horse herd, leaving hundreds of people homeless in the freezing cold. Colonel Nelson Miles pursued Sitting Bull's band through the snow, engaging them repeatedly, pressing them north toward the Canadian border. The strategy was not to defeat the warriors in pitched battle, though that happened when opportunity presented itself. The strategy was to make life impossible. Destroy the food. Destroy the shelter. Kill or capture the horses. Force the people to choose between the reservation and starvation. It worked. By the spring of 1877, the great alliance that had gathered at the Little Bighorn was shattered. Band after band came into the agencies and surrendered. The old life was ending not with a single defeat, but with the slow, grinding pressure of an industrial civilization against a nomadic one. Crazy Horse surrendered at the Red Cloud Agency on May 6, 1877, less than a year after his greatest victory. He came in with approximately 900 people and over 2,000 horses, and the column that approached the agency stretched for 2 miles. It was, eyewitnesses said, one of the most impressive sights they had ever seen, a warrior nation coming in from the wild for the last time, proud and unbroken in spirit even as they surrendered the physical reality of their freedom. Crazy Horse was 36 years old. He had never lost a battle. He had never signed a treaty. He had never been photographed. And now he was walking into a world that had no place for what he was. He lasted less than 5 months. On September 5, 1877, Crazy Horse was killed at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The circumstances of his death are debated. He had become increasingly restless and unhappy on the reservation. There were rumors that he was planning to leave, to go north and fight again. The army decided to arrest him. When soldiers and agency scouts tried to take him into custody, a struggle broke out. Crazy Horse may have drawn a knife. A soldier bayoneted him. The wound was fatal. He died that night. He was 37 years old. His parents took his body and buried it in a location that has never been revealed. To this day, no one outside his family knows where Crazy Horse lies. Sitting Bull crossed the border into Canada in May of 1877, taking his Hunkpapa band across the Medicine Line, as the Lakota called the international boundary, into the country they called Grandmother's Land because it was ruled by Queen Victoria. The Canadian authorities, personified by the mounted police under Major James Walsh, treated Sitting Bull with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was allowed to stay but was given no rations, no supplies, no assistance. The Canadian government did not want an influx of American Indians who might cause trouble with their own native peoples, and they made clear that Sitting Bull's band would have to support itself. For 4 years, Sitting Bull and his people struggled to survive in Canada. The buffalo were disappearing there too, killed off by the same relentless commercial hunting that had stripped the American plains. The winters were brutal. Food was scarce. People starved. Children died. Band members drifted away, crossing back into the United States to surrender at the agencies because the alternative was watching their families die. In July of 1881, Sitting Bull himself came back across the border and surrendered at Fort Buford, Dakota Territory. He had fewer than 200 people left. They were emaciated and ragged. The man who had united the Lakota nation and led them to the greatest victory in their history came in looking like a refugee, which is exactly what he was. He was imprisoned for 2 years at Fort Randall. He was then allowed to live at the Standing Rock Agency. He participated briefly in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, traveling to eastern cities and appearing before crowds who paid to see the man who had killed Custer, which is what the publicity materials said, though Sitting Bull had not personally fought in the battle and had never claimed to have killed anyone at the Little Bighorn. He returned to Standing Rock. He remained a leader, a voice of resistance to the ongoing erosion of Lakota rights and land. And for this, he was considered dangerous by the Indian agents who administered the reservation. On December 15, 1890, Indian police sent to arrest Sitting Bull at his cabin on the Grand River shot and killed him during a struggle. He was 59 years old. The greatest leader the Lakota had ever produced died in a scuffle at his own front door, killed by other Lakota who had been enlisted as tools of the government that had taken everything from all of them. 2 weeks later, on December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, intercepted a band of Minneconjou Lakota under Bigfoot at Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. When soldiers attempted to disarm the band, shooting broke out. The 7th Cavalry opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns, rapid-firing artillery that poured explosive shells into the camp. Between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children were killed. 25 soldiers died, many of them hit by their own crossfire. The Army called it a battle. Everyone else has called it a massacre. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their actions at Wounded Knee. It was, in the terrible symmetry of history, the same regiment that had been destroyed at the Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. The frontier wars were over. The free life of the Plains tribes was over. The world that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had fought to preserve was gone, replaced by reservations and rations, and the systematic destruction of everything that had made the Lakota who they were. Their children would be taken to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their own language. Their ceremonies would be outlawed. Their land would be further reduced by allotment acts that broke communal holdings into individual plots that could be, and were, sold to white settlers. The victory at the Little Bighorn did not save them. It may have hastened their destruction. The anger that the victory provoked in white America translated into a political will to finish the conquest that might otherwise have taken longer or proceeded with somewhat less brutality. Whether this would actually have been the case is impossible to know, but the argument has been made by historians for over a century, and it carries a weight of plausibility that makes it difficult to dismiss. The people who won the Battle of the Little Bighorn lost everything. The people who lost the battle won everything. This is the central fact that the myth of Custer's last stand was designed to obscure, and it succeeded in obscuring it for a very long time. But while the myth was being built in the East, the physical reality of the battlefield remained in Montana, and the ground itself carried evidence that the myth could not suppress forever. Within a year of the battle, the shallow graves on the ridges had begun to deteriorate. The hard ground had not held the thin covering of dirt that the burial parties had scraped over the bodies. Rain and wind and the burrowing of animals had exposed bones. Coyotes and wolves had scattered remains across the hillsides. Skulls lay in the open. Femurs protruded from the eroded soil. The battlefield looked, according to visitors, like a boneyard. A reburial expedition was sent in 1877. It was supposed to collect the scattered remains and provide proper interment. The expedition found the battlefield in a state of horrifying disarray. Many graves had been completely emptied by scavengers. Bones were found hundreds of yards from where the original graves had been dug. Identification was impossible in most cases. The remains of multiple individuals were gathered into common graves. In some cases, horse bones and human bones were mixed together, and no one could be entirely certain which was which. Custer's remains were exhumed and sent east for reburial at West Point, the military academy where he had graduated last in his class 15 years earlier. A grand funeral was held. Elizabeth attended in black. But there has always been doubt about whether the remains buried at West Point are actually Custer's. The body recovered from the battlefield in 1877 was identified primarily by its location on Last Stand Hill, where witnesses remembered burying him, and by the assumption that a body in that location must be Custer. But the shallow grave had been disturbed by animals and weather. Other bodies had been in the same area. The identification was, at best, an educated guess. George Armstrong Custer may or may not be buried at West Point. He is certainly buried somewhere. Whether the bones in his grave are his bones is a question that DNA testing could answer, but that the Army and the Custer family have never authorized. The uncertainty is, perhaps, appropriate. A man whose life was built on image and whose death was immediately converted into myth deserves, in some cosmic sense, an uncertain grave. The markers that stand on the battlefield today, white marble stakes placed in 1890 to indicate where soldiers fell, are approximate at best. They are based on the burial party's recollections, on the locations of bones found during subsequent visits, on the general landscape of the fight as understood by people who were trying to make sense of a scene of chaos and horror. Some markers are probably close to where the men actually died. Others are certainly wrong. The battlefield landscape itself has changed over the past century and a half, erosion altering the contours of the ridges, grass growing over disturbed ground, the river shifting its course in the bottomland. The Little Bighorn that exists today is not exactly the Little Bighorn that existed on June 25, 1876. It is close, but it is not the same. What remains the same is the quality of the place. Visitors to the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument consistently describe a feeling that is difficult to put into words, a sense of weight, of presence, of something in the ground and the air that speaks to what happened there. The wind moves through the grass the way it has always moved. The sky stretches overhead in that enormous Montana way. The ridges roll north from the river in gentle swells. And the white markers, the hillside, each one representing a man who died in a place he had never been before, for reasons he may not have fully understood, following orders given by a commander who had led him into a trap. The battlefield is quiet now. It has been quiet for 150 years, except for the wind and the tourists and the occasional ceremony. But the questions it raises are not quiet at all, and they have never been fully answered. How do you remember a disaster? Do you remember it as heroism, because heroism makes the dead meaningful and their sacrifice purposeful? Or do you remember it as it was, a catastrophe born of arrogance and ambition and the collision of two worlds that could not coexist, because truth, however painful, is the only monument the dead deserve? The answer that America chose, for most of its history, was heroism. The answer that the evidence demands is something else entirely. And the gap between those two answers is where the real story of the Little Bighorn lives. The military investigations that followed the battle were designed not to find the truth, but to manage the truth, to channel it into conclusions that served institutional interests rather than historical accuracy. The Army needed someone to blame. The dead could not be blamed because the dead were heroes. Custer could not be blamed because blaming Custer meant admitting that the Army had given independent command to a man whose judgment was fatally compromised by personal ambition. The blame fell on the living. Major Marcus Reno was the primary target. In 1879, Reno requested a court of inquiry to clear his name from the accusations that had been leveled against him, primarily in the press and by Elizabeth Custer's supporters. The inquiry, held in Chicago over several weeks in January and February of 1879, heard testimony from dozens of witnesses and produced a record that runs to thousands of pages. The court's finding was carefully worded. It concluded that while Reno's conduct did not merit a court-martial, there was nothing in his behavior that deserved particular commendation either. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fence-sitting, designed to avoid controversy rather than establish truth. The inquiry did not blame Reno. It did not exonerate him. It simply moved on, leaving the questions unanswered and the blame unfixed. Reno's subsequent career was a disaster. He was court-martialed twice on unrelated charges, the second time resulting in his dismissal from the Army for conduct unbecoming an officer. He died in 1889, broken and bitter, a man who may or may not have deserved the opprobrium that was heaped on him, but who certainly deserved better than he got from the institution he had served for most of his adult life. In 1967, the Army posthumously upgraded his discharge from dishonorable to honorable. In death, Reno received a measure of the justice that had been denied him in life. Whether it mattered to anyone but his descendants is an open question. Captain Frederick Benteen fared somewhat better in the immediate aftermath, but not in the long run. He was promoted to major and continued to serve for several years. But he was increasingly bitter about the way the battle had been portrayed and about the sainthood that had been conferred on Custer by Elizabeth and her supporters. Benteen had despised Custer in life, and he saw no reason to revere him in death. He wrote long, detailed letters to other officers and to historians, describing Custer's mistakes in terms that were blunt and unforgiving. He called Custer a coward. He called him a fool. He said the disaster was entirely Custer's fault, and that anyone who said otherwise was either a liar or an idiot. Benteen's letters are among the most valuable primary sources for understanding the battle, but they must be read with the understanding that they were written by a man who had powerful personal reasons for wanting Custer's reputation destroyed. Benteen retired from the army in 1888 and died in 1898. He drank heavily in his later years. His bitterness consumed him. He had survived the battle, but not the aftermath. The Army's institutional response to the Little Bighorn was revealing. The weapons issue was addressed with notable speed. The Springfield carbine's extraction problem was acknowledged, and modifications were made to the extractor mechanism in subsequent models. Within a few years, the Army began transitioning to magazine-fed rifles that gave individual soldiers a much higher rate of fire. The tactical lessons of the battle were studied and incorporated into revised cavalry doctrine. The intelligence failures were noted and new procedures for scouting and reconnaissance were developed. But the fundamental lesson, that native warriors were capable of sophisticated tactical operations that could defeat conventional military forces, was never fully absorbed by the Army's institutional culture. The myth of savage inferiority was too deeply embedded. The victory at the Little Bighorn was explained away as an anomaly, a product of unique circumstances that were unlikely to recur, rather than recognized as evidence of genuine military capability on the part of the Lakota and Cheyenne. This institutional blindness would have consequences that extended far beyond the frontier wars, shaping American military attitudes toward unconventional opponents for generations. The assumption that technological superiority and professional training would always overcome an enemy who knew the terrain and had the will to fight would be tested again and again, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam, and in other places where the ghost of the Little Bighorn should have been a warning, but was instead just a story about a golden-haired hero who died fighting savages. The truth was buried with the bodies on those Montana ridges. The truth was covered with dirt and sagebrush, and then with marble markers, and then with paintings and poems and movies and textbooks, each layer making it harder to see what was underneath. But the truth was there all along, waiting in the ground, waiting for someone to look for it with the right tools and the right questions. And eventually, someone did.